Welcome back to Newsroom International. We take you around the world in 60 minutes. We all know that diabetes is a serious disease. It can have deadly complications. But what you might not know is...
Tonight, the deadly disease gripping the nation.
Type 2 diabetes isn't just a ticking time bomb. It's already exploding all around us, and that's...
Type 2 diabetes is the leading cause of heart disease and stroke in this country, and being diagnosed can feel like a life sentence.
But a Houston cardiologist says...
And I probably was a type 2 diabetic before that, but like many people in America, I didn't know it.
30 million people have diabetes in the United States, but there's...
Fighting diabetes, the disease remains a major threat to public health. And what's behind the rapid rise of diabetes around the globe? The World Health Organization says diabetes...
1 in 4 people with diabetes don't even know they have it. It's an epidemic, I would say.
You said it. It's absolutely a real epidemic. We're losing the...
Experts are warning it's now reaching crisis levels. Diabetes is nearly 3 times more common than all cancers combined, and we're all potentially at risk from getting...
So they don't go get checked for diabetes.
Right.
So a lot of people are walking around and they think they're healthy. I thought I was healthy.
Who is at risk of developing this condition?
Well, if you have a body, you're at risk. And so
we're losing the battle, unfortunately. We're gaining about 1 million diabetic patients a year.
Why is this happening? I still don't get it.
We've all heard of diabetes. We know which foods we're supposed to eat and which we're supposed to avoid. And yet, as a society, day by day, year by year, we seem to be becoming less healthy. How is this happening? And why? I wish I had simple answers to these difficult questions, but we are humans, and we get sick just like every other species on Earth. Sometimes it's because of external forces, like our environment and what we eat or drink. And other times it's a twist of fate. Some of us may be born with the possibility of diabetes imprinted into our DNA.
I've seen diabetes firsthand. I have friends and family members who are diabetic. I know that every day people die because of diabetes, but not until recently did I realize just how deadly diabetes has become. From 1990 to 2013, there was a 70% increase of diabetes within the United States. Every 17 seconds, someone is diagnosed with diabetes, and every 6 seconds, someone dies because of diabetes. That means, if you go by averages, from the time I started walking up until this step right here, 5 more diabetics will have just passed away. How many more steps will we have to take before we can reverse this terrible trend?
In our ever-evolving world, the stakes have never been higher. Just as food corporations and fast food chains have exported their mass-produced products to every corner of our planet, the cases of all major types of diabetes have skyrocketed. This is not a coincidence. And knowing this, I was determined not to become another statistic. My fear of leading an unhealthy lifestyle led me to make some big changes, including a change of scenery. A few years ago, my wife and I left the familiarity and comfort of Southern California and Southern California cuisine to make a fresh start abroad.
We moved all the way across the Pacific and found a new home here in New Zealand.
We came to a country full of plentiful fresh fruit and vegetables, and a landscape that would beckon even the hardiest couch potato into action. And yet, we found that a change in location did not necessarily translate into a change of diet, or a change in habits. Rates of obesity and diabetes in New Zealand, just like in the US, are growing at an alarming pace. Why is this, I wondered? Was I still in danger of becoming a diabetic here, or anywhere?
So I've decided to investigate this issue. I wanted to know, what is diabetes exactly? What does it do to our bodies, and why? What causes us to get diabetes? And Is there any hope for those of us already suffering from diabetes to improve our health?
My name is Judd Resnick. I'm not a doctor and I have no medical training, but I'm still incredibly concerned with my health and with yours. That's why I set out to find some real answers to these complex questions. To unlock the mysteries of diabetes, I've traveled halfway around the world, from New Zealand to America and back again. I had the opportunity to sit down with a variety of doctors, nutritionists, physical fitness experts, educators, parents, students, and diabetics, and they've all helped to give me a better understanding about this deadly disease.
In this series, we'll uncover some important truths and vital information about what many experts are calling the defining health crisis of this generation. Welcome to That Diabetes Documentary.
Diabetes is a lot of things to different people.
Diabetes can lead on to so many other health complications.
Diabetes is kind of like a moving target. What's working today may not work tomorrow.
The statistics say there's 29 to 30 million people with diabetes and 1/3 don't know it.
Diabetes is a progressive disease and tends to get worse with time.
Diabetes is unquestionably the commonest cause of kidney failure in New Zealand. It is still, I think, the commonest cause of adult blindness. It's a major contributor to coronary heart disease.
Type 2 diabetes around the world is exploding, and it's especially happening in countries like America.
America's in big trouble, and that's my soapbox, but I really think that our diets are so poor that we are going to have millions and billions of dollars of complications for everybody.
In our series, we're going to break new ground by revealing amazing secrets to successfully managing and, in some cases, perhaps even reversing a diabetes diagnosis.
When the diabetic specialist said, you know, people do this and that cures their diabetes. And I was like, you can cure diabetes doing this? It was like, wow.
We'll investigate the medicine, science, and technologies of diabetes.
The pharmaceutical industry generally is looking for improvement in therapies that will improve outcomes for patients and improve daily life issues like weight gain. So I'm an innovator, and I really lean forward when it comes to technology and like to work in new technologies, so I'm sort of biased in my answer, I'm sure. But I don't think it's something we should fear. It's coming.
We're going to travel to the supermarket to uncover the truth of proper nutrition.
We're going to see more nutrition in this mix of holistic care than I feel we ever have before. It's about prevention, and eating was at the top of the list, followed by physical activity. Oh my gosh, how novel is that?
Which foods should you consume to help heal your health, and why?
Fortunately, we are now swinging back the pendulum from the fat phobia to where we know that there are heart-healthy fats that we should be including in our diet.
We're also going to highlight the importance of exercise in relation to diabetes, and we'll showcase some outside-the-box, easy and fun methods to get your heart pumping.
I think it is extremely important for a diabetic to exercise, and it doesn't have to be mountain biking, but you need to be able to get your heart rate up, you need to break a sweat, and it needs to challenge you. There's so many positive things to exercise.
Together, let's solve some of the biggest mysteries of diabetes.
I've never been this healthy, fit, or happy. So this is type 2 diabetes. It's a good thing.
In this episode, we'll begin our quest for the hidden truths of diabetes. We're going to investigate the reasons behind the sudden and dramatic rise in diabetes diagnoses in America and all across the world. We'll break down the various forms of diabetes and what it means to be classified as having either type 1, type 2, or prediabetes. We'll hear from a variety of people living with diabetes, and we'll meet Nigel Southam, a former type 2 diabetic. He'll share his story and reveal his secrets for successfully combating this disease. There are three main forms of diabetes: type 1, type 2, and gestational diabetes, or diabetes of pregnancy. Type 1 diabetes is considered an autoimmune disease, one that can strike anyone at any time. Type 2 diabetes has been shown to occur in those who are overweight. In so many ways, diabetes comes down to the relationship we have with our food.
Looks pretty good, doesn't it? Believe me, it smells even better. And I'm sure it tastes even more better. You get the idea. You probably also get the idea that pizza and other food like this, while delicious, might not be the best option for diabetics. But why is that exactly? Scientifically speaking, how does food like this lead to an outcome like this?
To understand diabetes, maybe we should first examine the meaning behind the word. The disease we call diabetes is actually named diabetes mellitus. The phrase diabetes mellitus is a combination of Greek and Latin. Diabetes comes from the Greek word diabetes, which means to pass through or siphon. Mellitus is Latin for honey sweet. But why is this disease described with these words?
Well, what diabetes means is it means that your blood sugar is too high. And it's actually a whole spectrum of diseases. There's a lot of ways you can get too high blood sugar.
So whenever we eat our food, our body digests it, breaks it down eventually to glucose or sugar. It goes into the bloodstream, and then it's supposed to go from the bloodstream to the cells, and that's where we get our energy. In order for the glucose or sugar to get from the bloodstream to the cells, you need this hormone called insulin. It kind of opens the door and lets the glucose in.
We all need glucose. Glucose is a carbohydrate. You've probably heard of carbs. The carbohydrate glucose is what is referred to as a simple sugar. It's an essential source of energy for the brain. In fact, it's the main source of energy for our entire body. Glucose is created when carbohydrates are consumed and digested. The digestive system converts carbs into this simple sugar and sends this sugar into the bloodstream. The amount of glucose in the bloodstream is what is known as blood sugar or blood glucose. And when glucose enters the bloodstream, the brain will detect this and then trigger the pancreas to produce insulin. Insulin is a key, literally, a key which opens a very important door. Insulin molecules attach to glucose molecules, and insulin receptor sites of cells, recognizing the insulin, allow glucose to pass through and become absorbed by cells as a source of energy. But if you have more sugar in your bloodstream than your body needs, insulin can lead surplus glucose to be stored in the liver for future use. It's this reserve of glucose which our bodies use for energy during those hours in the day when we're not eating. However, when we consistently take in more glucose than our bodies use for fuel, this surplus glucose will end up becoming stored as fat. This is why insulin is so important to our bodies. It helps regulate our blood sugar levels. Too little glucose and we lose energy. This condition is what's referred to as hypoglycemia. But too much glucose in our bloodstream over long periods can cause severe damage throughout our bodies. This is what is known as hyperglycemia, and this is where diabetes comes into the picture.
What happens with diabetes is that process, the digestion process still works. It makes glucose turns in the blood, but either with type 1, the problem is there's just not enough insulin there. With type 2, the initial problem is what we call insulin resistance, meaning there's insulin there, it doesn't work as well, so you need more insulin to kind of allow the glucose in. The body can initially supply that by just making more insulin. Eventually, it gets to the point where it can't keep up with the demand, and that's when you have diabetes.
Insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity. These two phrases are at the core of diabetes. Insulin sensitivity is a good thing. It means that muscle cells are properly responding to insulin. So what is insulin resistance? Well, over time, type 2 diabetics will become increasingly resistant to the insulin their pancreases produce, meaning their muscle cells will have a harder and harder time absorbing blood glucose. Why is this exactly? Let's use this lock and this key as an analogy. Imagine that this lock is a muscle cell somewhere in your body, and this key is an insulin molecule. Well, normally, and so blood glucose is free to enter this muscle cell. But now imagine you've spent many a year eating in an unhealthy manner and avoiding exercise. Well, in that case, this muscle cell may become clogged with fat. The fats stored in your muscle cells are known as intramyocellular lipids. But the more that intramyocellular lipids build up, this is insulin resistance. And if you have resistance to insulin, that means that the sugar you've just consumed, perhaps from a slice of bread or maybe a bag of chips, or even from a cup of coffee, can now have dangerous and even deadly consequences.
Sugar is a double-edged sword. When we mean sugar, we mean glucose. That's the only sugar that's floating around in our blood in any large amount. Now, it's an essential energy source for our brain and other organs, so we have to have it. But if it gets too high, it causes damage to our body because it's a very chemically reactive sugar, and it starts binding chemically to all sorts of components in our bloodstream and in our organs and damaging them. And over time, that damage damages blood vessels, it damages nerves, it damages the kidney, and we start to get all these what we call diabetic complications. In other words, all these side effects of the diabetes with the damage to the organs. And it's that high glucose being chemically reactive over that long period of time that's causing that.
These complications are what is so frightening about diabetes. Living with diabetes could mean you losing a limb to amputation, losing your eyesight to diabetic retinopathy, or losing your life to a heart attack. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at the symptoms you should watch out for and the complications you would hope to avoid when it comes to diabetes. But for now, we should understand that these symptoms, a diabetes diagnosis, and the many scary and deadly complications are all rooted in one simple thing: blood glucose, the sugar within our bodies.
Glucose is like petrol, like fuel for our body. We need it. It's essential for us to have it, right? But just like fuel, where you get in trouble is if you start storing it in the wrong place. In your car, you keep it in the petrol tank and it's all fine. When it starts spilling out of the petrol tank and you've got it in your cup holders in the front seat and big cans of it in the back seat, that's when things start going wrong. And that's what's happening in the build-up to diabetes. We're putting all this energy into fat and then into other tissues all around our body, and it's messing them up and they're not functioning properly. So it's a valuable energy source, but you've got to use it just the right way and look after it properly, otherwise it'll cause damage.
For all types of diabetes, it comes down to the interplay between blood sugar and insulin. But let's take a look at the similarities and the important differences between the various forms of diabetes.
We like to think of it these days as a spectrum. And so on one end of the spectrum, you have classic type 2 diabetes, and that's the kind of diabetes that adults traditionally got. We used to call type 2 adult onset diabetes. And in this kind of diabetes, people are making insulin. Their bodies just don't respond to it very well. They're resistant to it. So they're making it, don't respond well, they get high blood sugar. On the other end of the spectrum, you have classic type 1 diabetes. That's what kids traditionally got. That's what they used to call juvenile onset diabetes.
There's an interesting connection between autoimmune disease and diabetes. So we know that type 1 diabetes is actually an autoimmune condition when the body starts to attack the pancreas and the cells that produce insulin, and then we end up not being able to produce our own insulin.
I have several family members who have type 1 diabetes, but I didn't get my first close look at type 1 until I was in college.
My friend and college roommate, Ryan Preventure, has had type 1 diabetes since childhood. Every day, several times a day, he tests his blood sugar levels. But with type 1 diabetes, even when you stay on top of your condition, you can still suffer dangerous complications.
In fact, I had witnessed one such incident when one morning before class I found Ryan convulsing and unresponsive. Luckily, Ryan had the foresight to warn me that this might happen, and he had previously showed me how to administer this, a shot of glucagon. This medicine helped keep Ryan from slipping into a coma. Paramedics came and took Ryan to the hospital, where he spent several days recuperating. Though as I remember it, I was the one who was shaken. It was truly terrifying to see a friend, to see someone so young rushed to a hospital. That day, that moment, is still fresh in my mind.
So I traveled back to California and met up with Ryan at his home in Los Angeles to hear his thoughts on diabetes.
I think diabetes, is, especially type 1 diabetes, that people might not think of is it's always there. It's always a part of who you are. Every minute of every day, you're a diabetic, and diabetes is always there. It's a constant in your life. That doesn't mean that it controls you, but it permeates in your life in ways that you might not think of.
For years, Ryan has taken great care to manage his diabetes. But for him, the day of his diagnosis still feels like it was yesterday.
I was diagnosed with diabetes, type 1 diabetes, back on November 8th, 1993. So I was a freshman in high school, and normal blood sugars for a person who doesn't have diabetes is around 80 to 120. That's the blood sugar number that's normal for people. I was 880. So it was like immediate knowing that I actually had diabetes. It wasn't even a question. What they said was I was a week away from a coma. In regards to just type 1 diabetes and where I think it's going and how it's been, you know, it is one of those diseases that is right now there is no cure. I always look at it as that I'm going to have it for the rest of my life. And I think that's how you have to kind of look at it, and how diabetics that are becoming diabetics right now have to look at it. However, it's getting easier and easier to be a type 1 diabetic.
Ryan is a classic example of an adolescent diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. He's worked strenuously throughout his life to maintain a healthy lifestyle, and so far has suffered relatively few complications. But not every type 1 diabetic can be as lucky as Ryan.
Cameron is my son. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 14. He was a very good patient right from the start. He picked up the needle and he gave himself a shot, and he did his finger sticks. So he was in good control. He did exercise, he did work out, he was in great shape, which is kind of the tragedy of all this, is because you can be a diabetic, you can be in great shape, you can do everything right, and you can still die.
Cameron Morrison died tragically at the age of 20 due to a hypoglycemic event. His mother, Dr. Julie Morrison, knows the dangers of diabetes, as she not only treats diabetic patients, but, just like Cameron, is a type 1 diabetic herself. Today, she honors his memory and seeks to help other diabetics through Team Cameron, a group which raises funds through charity walks for the American Diabetes Association. Dr. Morrison hopes to spread knowledge about how to better manage both type 1 and type 2 diabetes.
You always think of the diabetic that eats whatever they want and does whatever they want and forgets their pills, doesn't take their shots. You know, those are the ones that get in trouble, but that's not true. That's the tragedy. That people with diabetes, doesn't matter if they're good or bad control, they can still have bad outcomes.
In type 1 diabetes, you get pretty sick pretty quickly. And so that's why screening is important. There are no symptoms in the early stages, and that's a key point.
I used to think that type 1 diabetes was something you were born with, but it turns out it's something anyone can develop at any age, and so this is something of which we all need to be aware. But what about type 2 diabetes?
Type 1 is the form that's seen more often than not in children, which is due to an autoimmune destruction of the pancreas where the pancreas no longer makes insulin, and thus insulin must be taken as medication for survival. Type 2 diabetes is related to resistance to insulin, so the body can continue to make insulin, it just doesn't function in the way that it did earlier in one's life.
Type 2 diabetes. This is the most prominent form of diabetes, both in America and all across the world. It is estimated that 90 to 95% of all diabetes diagnoses are type 2. Though type 2 is a vastly different condition than type 1, they both lead to the same variety of medical complications.
Both type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes end up with the same symptoms ultimately, even though they're caused by totally different events in the body. And a whole lot of things are conspiring together to make it harder and harder for the insulin you have in your body to work properly. And therefore, eventually, it gets to the point where it really can't work well enough at all. Your body can't make enough insulin to compensate, and you become diabetic.
It's important to make sure that people are screened regularly for type 2 diabetes if people have risk factors, so family history of type 2 diabetes, being over the age of 40, men and women is generally the time to start getting checked. And if people have had, or women have had diabetes during their pregnancy, that can be a marker of being at high risk. Being overweight, being relatively sedentary, can all be part of the picture.
I want to live, so I'm going to do what I need to do to live. And having diabetes is a surefire way, you know, if I were to go whole hog and everything I wanted, to be dead in about a month. That's just, you know, not that fast, but it's pretty close to it in regards to how quickly it can shut down all your bodily systems. And that's also the scary part.
I sat down with Andrea Sovereign at her home in Sierra Vista, Arizona, where she told me about her difficult and daily struggles with type 2 diabetes.
I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad we can talk about this today. I really am. Diabetes is a challenge, plain and simple.
It was diagnosed 2.5 years ago. Prior to that, I actually was diagnosed with hypoglycemia, otherwise known as prediabetes, when I was 17. So I lived with that for 23 years before it flipped to being diabetes. One of the things that you do is supposed to check your blood sugar every morning. Some days I'm really good about it, some days I'm not. It really depends on how I'm feeling. If I'm just like, oh, okay. No, I know what it feels like to be okay. And when I've had a bad couple of days, I'm like, okay, let's check this, see what's going on. And that's, like this morning I had to do that because I had issues. It's been the holidays, and I'm tired of denying myself yummy goodness. I make awesome food, great stuffing, great pie. I want some pie. I made it, dang it. So I make it and I'll eat it, and then I go right back to that really, really bad feeling. But the one thing I do know is that I have to keep to pretty strict dietary rules to be functional. That's just become key. There's been times where my blood sugar will get so low, I'm staggering to the kitchen, to the refrigerator, and I will grab whatever I can and suck on it so I can get my blood sugar so I don't pass out.
You know, some people don't change. They find out they have diabetes, they don't change, and they're dead within a year.
I think the important point to make about type 2 diabetes is that it is almost certainly not one condition. And I'm sure whether it's in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, there are going to be a number of different types of type 2 diabetes clearly established. But what we do know is that it is a complex interaction between genes and environment.
This is really a condition of blood sugar dysregulation, and people are not able to properly respond to the signals that their body sends. And we oftentimes see this very, very commonly in people with autoimmune disease, that they will have some degree of blood sugar dysregulation, carbohydrate intolerance, and they may not have diabetes yet, but they're on their way to have it.
For someone's pancreas to cease insulin production, or for a person's muscle cells to become resistant to insulin, is not like having a switch flipped. It takes time, and this progression from insulin sensitivity to insulin resistance can be charted. Your doctor can take tests and determine if you are on a path towards diabetes. This path has a name: prediabetes.
The important thing about the term prediabetes is that actually the development of diabetes is a continuum. It's not like the flu where one day you didn't have it and the next day you do have it. Diabetes is something that's developing over a long period of time. Actually, both type 1 and type 2 are developing over a long period of time. But the month before you were well on the way to diabetes, 6 months before you were well on the way to diabetes, so you can see the warning signs from a long, long way off. So prediabetes is something you need to be very aware of and react the same way as if you have real diabetes, because it's on the slope towards diabetes.
I think there's a huge proportion of people out there that are pre-diabetic that really have no idea. And I don't think we do a good enough job talking to them about that, because it's not an emergency, really. You know, if they come in and they have a blood sugar that's, like 170, 180, not technically diabetes yet, but that's also not normal. And so we see that all the time.
Prediabetes is something that we could arrest once it's diagnosed. So that's a blood glucose, we'll say about 100, and some docs are saying 99. 99 up to 125, 126. If you're 126 fasting, you're diabetic. They'll probably do another test to run to confirm that. But we'll say prediabetes, fasting blood glucose 8 hours at least, of 100 to about 125. There's many people walking around with that blood glucose level.
Prediabetes, the biggest thing that you're going to have problems with is food. So I probably should be a bit more of a meal planner than I am, but I'm not.
Natalie Hyland is an American student studying geology at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. She was diagnosed as pre-diabetic during her teens.
When I was about 15, I was sick. Like my energy levels would be really low 1 second and then just super high. So it seemed like, yeah, there were some blood sugar problems there, and it can affect your hormones. So that's another thing that was sort of cluing us up that something might have been wrong. So I went in and got a blood sugar test and some other things, and I wasn't quite high enough to be on the threshold of diabetic, but they diagnosed it as prediabetes, and I started metformin when I was 15. I mean, I might have been a few pounds overweight at some stages with a BMI, but I was never at a really critical level where they needed to start scaring me. And because I was 15, I took their advice very seriously to heart and became then very underweight and sort of battled with other things like with that, you know, and that's also part, I'm going to blame societal pressures and just growing up in the States and, you know, that sort of thing. So for a moment there, you know, I was being yelled at for being too thin by my doctors. I think when you're 15, it's a little bit different. You're much more influenceable than I think someone who's had the same lifestyle habits for 20 years. I guess I just did my homework and tried to do my best, which is basically what I do with everything in my life, I guess.
At this point, you may be asking yourself, could I be in danger of becoming a diabetic? The answer for you and everyone in short is yes, but before you start to worry, it's important to understand the symptoms associated with diabetes. They include hunger, headaches, increased thirst, blurred vision, confusion, exhaustion or drowsiness, excessive vomiting, or excessive urination. If you are experiencing any of these symptoms, you should go see your doctor immediately.
Once you get to a stage where, you know, people are really going downhill, you know, thirsty, urination, blurry vision, if it gets really bad, weight loss, you can also go into this condition called ketoacidosis, And these are all the symptoms that type 1s get very quickly, very early on. But in type 2s, if you don't make the diagnosis, then your pancreas can actually work pretty well to keep you out of having severe symptoms. But if let's just say you have type 2 diabetes, it's undiagnosed, you don't feel that great, but you don't feel that bad. And then all of a sudden you have a medical stress, heart attack, infection, that could throw you over the edge and make your blood sugar shoot up. And that's when people are also diagnosed, when they're admitted for some other problem.
Usually when people present with symptoms, they can be quite subtle in that in retrospect they can recall when they started feeling quite thirsty, getting up at night, going to the toilet to pass urine, and just having some blurred vision can be some of the subtle signs that blood sugar levels are going up in the blood.
The most common way someone with type 2 diabetes is diagnosed is by a routine physical when they didn't even know it. And the most common symptom, ready for this, is none. There are no symptoms in the early stages. And that's why screening is so important if type 2 diabetes runs in the family.
There are many important factors which determine who will or won't develop diabetes. But one key factor comes down to something none of us have any control over: our family history. To know if we may be in danger of developing diabetes, we must all take a close look at our genetics.
So genetics is part of type 1 and type 2 diabetes. There's very strong genetic components in both. And there's differences in the proportion of individuals developing diabetes by race and ethnic groups. So we find more Native Americans, more African Americans, and Asians developing type 2 diabetes, also so non-Hispanic whites are least likely to develop type 2 diabetes in childhood compared to these other groups. And then the flip for type 1 diabetes, that non-Hispanic whites are most likely to develop them. But yeah, there's a strong genetic component that goes through both.
My mother has diabetes. My brother actually has it's type 2, but he's worked on controlling his diabetes.
There is a history of diabetes in my family. My father's dad, he was type 1 diabetic, and that sort of led to his death eventually, so there were some genetic predispositions there.
In type 1 diabetes, it's unusual to have a relative with type 1 diabetes, but it does run in families.
My name is Jonathan Vogel. I've had type 1 diabetes for 11 years, since I was 8 years old. I'm Daniel Vogel. I've had diabetes since I was approximately 2.5.
The medical history of the Vogel brothers highlights the genetic risk for type 1 diabetes. I sat down to talk to them about their experiences at their home in Tucson, Arizona.
The day that I learned that I had diabetes, I look back on as somewhat of a funny story, actually. I was 8 years old, and it was the first day of Little League Baseball, first game of the season, and I had woken up in the morning really thirsty. I'd had to go to the bathroom like 5 times during the night, and by this point my brother had diabetes, so my mom kind of suspected. She tested my blood sugar, confirmed it, and I was so excited because I didn't know any better. All I knew was that Daniel had diabetes, and now I've got it too, and now we both have it together, and I was so happy that day.
I remember a doctor telling me this is not a death sentence, but somehow that's what I heard. It was a death sentence because it's very difficult, in my case, for a doctor to tell you your son has a disease that, by the way, has no cure. So to hear that your son will have this diagnosis for the rest of his life is just very difficult to accept.
Well, there is genetic susceptibility in type 1, but I can tell you that if you ask 100 people with type 2 diabetes, does it run in your family, parents, brothers, sisters, about 70 to 85% will say, yeah, it runs in my family. The joke is the other 10 to 15%, they're lying.
Genetics and diabetes, it still plays a major part. So with type 2 diabetes, it's really very, very strong pull to become a diabetic if you have diabetes running in your family.
Dr. Rachel Post, an emergency physician in San Diego, California, has extensive knowledge of diabetes and the genetic link, both as a doctor and as a type 1 diabetic herself.
Many of my family members have type 2 diabetes as well, and it's just gotten out of control completely. So in type 2, it's the percentages of, passing on type 2 diabetes to your child is up to, 60-something%, I believe. And, we don't see this as much in the United States because the diet here is a little bit less healthy. We tend to see overweight type 2 diabetics here. But in Europe, there's actually a pretty big proportion of slender type 2 diabetics there that are requiring insulin, not because of their lifestyle, but just because of the genetics alone. With type 1, it's still genetic, but there's a little bit less known about why it gets triggered in some people and not others. But, the chances of passing on genetically type 1 diabetes is a little bit less than type 2. So it's I think it's something like 7% for a female to a child and 9% for a male. And these statistics may be outdated, but that's drastically different than the 60% for type 2 diabetics.
Well, my mother's diabetic, and so I started noticing symptoms that I had heard from her and that she'd told me to be wary of. And after a couple of months of these symptoms, I went and told her about them because I thought, no, I'm going to have to get this checked out. So we did a quick blood prick on my finger, and my levels were way too high, and went to the doctor and did the real blood tests, and sure enough, type 2 diabetic.
Both John Richardson and his mother Sandy were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, but amazingly, they've each found lasting success in treating their conditions.
I listened to everything the doctor said, I listened to everything the nurse specialist said. I tried to do everything humanly possible to lower my HbA1 levels. I didn't go on one of the full crazy diets and cut carbs completely, but I did do my best to cut most carbohydrates where I could. It also helped that my mother had diabetes and I could go to her to ask for resources.
It's less about following just a diet, but more about a lifestyle change and having to look at increasing exercise. But I would think that looking at the amount of food as well as the quality of food, and by quality I mean perhaps not so much following a set type of diet as the type of quality of food. So in other words, fresh fruit, good quality food rather than, am I allowed to say crap food? We know that we are going to have a growing burden of younger people with obesity. Many of these younger people are going to go on to develop diabetes. Many of them are pre-diabetic now. And yet we don't have the capacity to deal with that in the healthcare system.
So genetic history can play a major role in diabetic risk. But there's another common thread in the story of the many forms of diabetes. And that is this, the modern world in which we live. In other words, our environment.
I think it is really important to emphasize that the environment is the critical aspect. Probably a lot more research has gone into the genetic factors, but the exponential rate of increase of type 2 diabetes is unquestionably very strong evidence that the environmental factors are pivotal.
A lot of what we think is related to the increase of diabetes occurring recently in the last 10 or 20 years is kind of changes in lifestyle, changes in eating patterns, and the rise of obesity that has occurred over the last few decades.
This, of course, is a map of the United States. It represents research conducted by the Centers for Disease Control. The study charted the percentage of overweight adults state by state. All right, Looks like there are only a handful of states with an obesity rate of over 10%. But hold on, this is data from 1985. What happens if we speed up the clock? You can see, year by year, America's population has become increasingly overweight. Within 15 years, by the year 2000, over 20 states had nearly a quarter of their adult population listed as obese. In 2001, Mississippi became the first state to experience an obesity rate of over 25%. Less than 5 years later, over 30% of Mississippi's adult population was categorized as obese. And by the year 2015, over 20 states had an adult obesity rate over 30%. And how many states had an adult population obesity rate of over 20%? All of them. Every state in America now has a significant percentage of adults who are categorized as obese. Looking at the US as a whole, the average percentage of obese adults, as of 1990, sat at just over 11%. But by 2015, only 25 years later, that number had risen to nearly 30%, which means that millions of adult Americans are now classified as extremely overweight. How did this happen, and why did it happen so quickly?
I think it's hard to identify one single factor, but our environment has changed dramatically over the last couple of decades. We are all less active than we have been. There's more processed food. We are eating more sugar and more fat.
Diabetes has no conscience. It attacks indiscriminately. Any of us can develop diabetes at any age. But American food companies, the corporations selling you your fast food and, yes, your supposedly healthy food, claim to be looking out for you and your well-being. However, as it stands today, we need to question the motives of these companies and their products. Why? Because it's these products that seem to be adding to our obesity epidemic, and everyday food we buy could be driving us all towards that dreaded diabetes diagnosis.
I'm the first person to admit and recognize that packaged processed foods, they taste delicious. They're easy and they're cheap, but what I also know is that it doesn't impact you positively. And I think whether you have diabetes or not, it impacts you negatively. But the reason that people with diabetes tend to notice that more often is because we have an instantaneous result. I eat something that's in a packaged and processed, I eat a packaged processed food and I definitely see the impact because I take my blood sugar 1 hour later. I go to Payway or PF Chang's or McDonald's or a whole slew of restaurants and they give me a food that I think is healthy for me and my blood sugar goes up. What does that mean? It means there's hidden ingredients in this food that I don't know that's there that is skyrocketing my blood sugar. So I really think nutrition is the key. I think America's in big trouble. And that's my soapbox, but I really think that our diets are so poor that we are going to have millions and billions of dollars of complications for everybody.
I think the link between obesity and type 2 diabetes in particular, although obesity can be very important in type 1 diabetes too, is very close, and there are a number of quite complex mechanisms why this is the case. But I think the simplest and arguably the most important association is that obesity is a very important predisposing factor to insulin resistance. The body becomes resistant to insulin as obesity increases.
Increased calories, increased carbs and fats, and then decreased activity are both sort of going in the direction of increasing your weight, increasing your obesity. And then once you increase your weight, that makes you more insulin resistant, makes it harder to lose weight, easier to gain weight, and it kind of becomes a vicious cycle.
You know, whether those that aren't overweight who appear to have type 2 diabetes have exactly the same disease isn't really known. But clearly weight brings it out. You know, it might be hiding, just you're genetically predisposed, but you don't show the signs until the extra weight increases the amount of insulin you need to control the sugar because of this resistance, and it works for a while, and then it peters out, and when the insulin no longer gets the sugar, keeps the sugars under control, then they go up, and then you appear with symptoms, and then you need treatment.
We're fighting our biology, right? Our biology tells us we need to survive. To survive, we've got to eat. And we've got to store a little bit more energy for a rainy day, for when we won't have food. That's what our brain is telling us all the time, and more so in some people than others. So when we try to say that people should lose weight and they should be healthier and they should be fitter, we are fighting very primitive, basic instincts we have in us, which are very, very difficult for us to control.
It's hard to do because not everyone has access to care, and sometimes people are headed towards diabetes because of difficult, social situation, poor diet, not enough time to exercise, and they have no primary care doctor. They have no way to even get one, and they have no idea that they even are moving towards that direction. And I think that that's something that, as a physician, we can do a lot of a better job at. And often we say, hey, by the way, your blood pressure's a little bit up. You need to go get that checked out. And I think not enough people are drawing attention to the fact that your sugar is not normal and that needs to be taken care of.
I think it's very hard for people to change their lifestyle or what they eat and how they exercise because it's so hardwired into them. And I think you've got to understand that for a start. And we take the attitude that it should be so easy because one or two people can do it, or there are skinny people in the world, therefore everyone should be able to be skinny, and so on. And it doesn't work that way. In real life, in the real world, there are powerful drivers, there are a whole range of reasons why people live the lifestyles they do, ranging from people eating for comfort because they're depressed, through to people just having a different metabolism from someone else and burning less energy. So if we treat it as a one-size-fits-all model, we will continue to fail, and we will sit there scratching our heads forever.
Most of the clients that I work with diabetes are dealing with type 2 diabetes, which used to be considered adult onset, and we typically just call it type 2 diabetes these days because children are now coming up with this syndrome.
It's true. Both type 1 and type 2 diabetes are on the rise for children, and at an alarming rate. The Search for Diabetes in Youth study discovered that type 2 diagnoses in children aged 10 to 19 increased 21% from 2001 to 2009. And the Centers for Disease Control found that nearly 1 in 4 American teenagers has prediabetes.
Here at Children's Hospital, over the last 12 or 13 years, 20% of the newly diagnosed children with diabetes have the type 2 form. When I was earlier in my training, we almost never saw type 2 diabetes in any age youth, and it appears to be linked temporally and physiologically to the simultaneous epidemic of obesity that we see in childhood.
I can recall coming to New Zealand from England in 1988 and commenting to somebody that I'd actually seen a young woman aged 30 with type 2 diabetes, whereas in Britain that would have been incredibly uncommon, and indeed it was relatively uncommon in New Zealand. I now have patients with type 2 diabetes who are pre-teenage, and I wouldn't even think to remark to somebody that I had seen such a person, because it is so commonplace now.
We have to ask ourselves, what are we doing to cause such a dramatic change in the health of such a young population? And what can we do to halt this dangerous trend?
I see some of the kids who are coming to see me, younger ones, ages 12, sometimes as young as 12, or 8 actually, that have prediabetes. And it's a combination of food. The availability of fast food is really almost in every corner, and it's cheap. And people are busy, so there's less time to cook. So it's very available. And the serving sizes, the portions, from 20 years ago to now have almost doubled. So when you used to go to have a burger, I have a poster in my office, it used to be like 280 calories. Now the same burger is way bigger and it's like 700 and something. And they give it to you and you eat everything that is in front of you.
A lot of it is nature versus nurture. And if we just eat unhealthy and watch our friends eat unhealthy and our family members eat unhealthy, that it's easy to fall into that unhealthy trap and then say, but it's just in my genetics. when we get that confused, because it's not in your genetics, it's in your lifestyle choices. Your genetics has nothing to do with you eating a double cheeseburger every day and double fries.
Unfortunately, we're seeing more young people, first with prediabetes, moving on then to type 2 diabetes, not understanding long-term complications. It's far from their mind, because why would a child ever have to worry about long-term complications? Well, we do have to worry about them.
And now, in America, there is an explosion, some say an epidemic, of not only obesity, but also diabetes. A 2014 study found that there are almost 30 million people in the US alone who have diabetes. That's nearly 10% of the national population. Those are scary numbers. But what is even more frightening is this. Almost 80 million people in the US, or 35% of the population, may actually have prediabetes. 30% of people classified as having prediabetes will develop type 2 diabetes within 5 years. And 70% of prediabetics will develop type 2 diabetes within their lifetime. If trends continue, if we as individuals and as a society continue to live the way that we do, by the year 2050, nearly 1 in 3 American adults will have diabetes. Okay, this is just America, home of the Whopper, land of the Big Mac. But what about the rest of the world? In 1980, 108 million people across the world had been diagnosed with diabetes. Only about 35 years later, in 2014, that number had risen to 422 million people with diabetes. By 2025, only a few years from now, that number is expected to exceed 700 million. That would mean that over 10% of the human race will be living with diabetes. But not every person who develops diabetes finds themselves with that diagnosis simply because they're eating too many cheeseburgers. In fact, millions of people have developed diabetes despite avoiding fast food. So, how is this possible?
The new incidences of diabetes have tripled. This is epidemic, and I really believe that living in this culture is difficult. And part of that has to do with, well, I would call it a perfect storm. We live in a digital world. We are very fast-paced. We are unfortunately getting away from the family meal. We're getting away from cooking and really spending time with food and learning these sorts of skills.
Throughout the whole world, not just here in New Zealand, you see the same trend. As soon as people move away from a lifestyle involving, a lot of hard work and limited access to food, through to a lifestyle where you don't have to exercise so much, where you stay warm all the time, and where you have free access to food, you get this shift happening. It's not just in New Zealand, and this is a symptom of the whole modern world. As we've got easier transportation, as our homes are far warmer, which means we burn less energy, and as our supply of food is easier, not just from McDonald's, but just every form of food is easier to get these days. And shops are open 24 hours, you can get food whenever you want. So that has all conspired across the world to increase people's weight, and that has been the trigger point for creating insulin resistance, and then that in turn puts more pressure on your beta cells that make your insulin, and eventually in some people that all fails, and you haven't got enough beta cells to work, and you've got type 2 diabetes. So it's a global phenomenon.
This global phenomenon carries with it a long and terrifying list of potential medical problems for every person affected by diabetes. To be one of the millions of people with type 1, type 2, gestational, or prediabetes means living with the potential of severe eye damage, including blindness. In fact, the leading cause of blindness is diabetes. Diabetes is also the leading cause of kidney failure, and the leading cause of amputations, and the leading cause of Alzheimer's disease. Gum disease is more common in adults with diabetes than those who do not have diabetes. And both gum disease and diabetes increase the risk of heart disease. children who develop type 2 diabetes may expect to have their life expectancy cut short by about 20 years. And diabetes doubles the risk of several forms of cancer.
So, what do all of these frightening facts add up to? Well, in America, diabetes is now the 7th most common cause of death. But this number is misleading, as the most common causes of death include heart disease, cancer, stroke, and Alzheimer's disease. And we know that diabetes can lead to these outcomes. So, diabetes may be, if not the most, then one of the most common causes of death in today's modern world.
Being notified that I was diabetic, yeah, you know, like I certainly didn't have a party afterwards, that's for sure.
Type 2 diabetes affects millions of people not just in America, but all across the world. People like New Zealand native Nigel Southam. He invited me to his home in Governor's Bay to talk about his experiences with diabetes.
I didn't realise I had the condition until probably about 5 years ago when I was diagnosed with it. How it was explained to me is that it's a lifestyle disease. You know, like sure, it can be, you know, like inherited, but for a lot of people it's a result of, you know, their lifestyle.
But Nigel didn't take his diagnosis as a sign of defeat. Instead, he decided to do something about his condition.
After being diagnosed with the disease, it was apparent to me that I had to take measures to sort of try and combat it. It was suggested that 3 main things that could help me beat the disease, if you like, and that was moderate eating, exercise, and basically subscribing to a healthy lifestyle. Interestingly enough, I really didn't manage to lose any weight for about 5 years until I recently started a part-time job. I'm a student and I supplement my income by working down at the Port of Lyttelton, which is quite a physical job, sort of lashing and unlashing the 40-foot containers on the big ships. And over the last 5 months, I've probably lost about 8-9 kilos, which remarkably actually sort of had a positive effect on my condition. And I was diagnosed recently after having bloods from being a full-blown diabetic to just being on the cusp of a pre-diabetic, which to me was fantastic news.
But while Nigel's history is unique, he is not alone. Amazingly, many other people have found lasting success in better managing and, in some cases, even lowering their blood sugar levels to below the diabetic threshold. And in this series, we'll meet some extraordinary former type 2 diabetics, people like Rachel Woodrow. Once overweight and diabetic, Rachel transformed her body and her life to the point that her doctor now classifies her as not having diabetes.
When I first found out I had type 2 diabetes, I cried, but because I was humiliated, and there's a stigma that goes with being type 2 diabetic, and that is that you're fat and overindulgent, and it's quite shameful. And I think this is why not a lot of people come out and say, well, actually I am a type 2 diabetic, or don't go and get tested, because there is a shame factor to it. So immediately when I got diagnosed, I was like, oh, I've got to do something. So it's been a journey. Initially, I did investigation and I came to the conclusion that 12,000 calories a day, calorie reducing, was a good idea. And so I did that. And I remember one day standing at the cupboard and stuffing in chocolate biscuits in my mouth and thinking, I hate myself. Why am I doing this? Why can't I stop doing this? And it occurred to me, I'm addicted to this stuff. I'm addicted to this sugar, to these chocolate biscuits, to these things that I have all through my house. So I just got that out of my life, and that immediately made a huge difference to my health. I didn't go from chocolate biscuits to eating little bits of chicken and some veggies and running 10K every weekend, and it's taken 4 years. And just take your time, and when you fall, get up, just get up. So I always have goals, and there's always goals that are food related, behaviour related, exercise related. Insurance companies are absolutely determined you can't reverse it, But doctors also, and I notice some of the big sites that are up in New Zealand say, well, there is no cure for type 2 diabetes. And I have contacted them and said, are you thinking about the implications of what you're saying, putting that on your website? I don't want to compare it to cancer as such, but if you had cancer and you had it removed and all your blood tests came back clear, you don't have cancer. Yes, it could come back, but likewise to me, in my mind, I haven't had diabetes for 3 years. I'm not about to go back to eating the way I ate before. I won't be obese anymore. I've changed my lifestyle. I don't have diabetes. And if those doctors want to believe that you can't reverse it, they can call it what they like. But if you've got that kind of doctor, please don't listen to them. My advice would be, you can change this. You can do this. If I could change it and do it, anyone can. And it's not about perfection. And it took you a long time to get diabetes, and it's going to take a while to sort it out.
In future episodes, we'll get more in depth with Rachel and other former type 2 diabetics like Sandy and her son John to learn how they too conquered their diabetes diagnoses.
I pretty much entirely cut out sugar. I probably went a little bit overboard, and as a result of about 6 to 8 months of effort of that, I have been declared no longer diabetic, which is really good.
John, Nigel, Rachel, and many other people's stories prove that there is hope for all of us.
Even if you suffer from diabetes, even if you're struggling with excess weight, you have the opportunity to improve your health.
One of the best things we can do as Americans is to work on preventing diabetes. And this would be becoming aware of what is going on with this in our culture.
When it comes to our society, we've become so accustomed to the soundbite answer. Make it quick, make it fast, fix it fast concept. Not necessarily seeing the long-term possible impact, negative impact of what you're doing.
I think the hardest part is finding the right way to eat and not doing this whole yo-yo thing. I think a lot of people are really all or nothing, and they'll be on really good track and then they'll just completely lose it and fall off the wagon. I think finding that middle is by far the hardest part, and that's something that I've struggled with, but it's been great for the last 3 or so years.
Would you say that you are, I guess, successfully managing prediabetes at the moment?
Yeah, I am, but I mean, it doesn't happen overnight, and you do need to work at it.
I think what needs to happen for the future is we need to be educating. We need to be educating families, we need to be educating parents, and we need to be educating kids and make sure that kids are eating healthier and they're exercising more and they're understanding that obesity is something that needs to be controlled very early on in life. The fact is it's getting worse and worse, and we need to find ways to make sure that we're curbing that. We're creating less type 2 diabetics, and we're helping the people as much as possible that have type 2 diabetes to be able to either cure it or control it as best as they can.
You have to be in charge of your dietary choices, your physical activity on the day-to-day, monitoring to see that in fact what you're doing, eating, exercise, medications, if they're in that batch, are being effective.
People need to understand, out of all the diseases they could have gotten, they have some control with diabetes. That's one disease you get that you can control. Everything else kind of go downhill slowly or rapidly, but with diabetes you can put the brakes on.
We've now spent some time looking into the basics of diabetes, but in upcoming episodes we're going to delve much deeper.
Well, I think the biggest message that people need to know is we have a cure for diabetes.
When the diabetic specialist said, you know, people do this and that cures their diabetes. And I was like, you can cure diabetes doing this? It was like, wow.
Former type 2 diabetic Sandy Richardson and others will give us key insights and reveal their unique methods for sustained weight loss and the lowering of their blood glucose levels to below the diabetic threshold. We'll hear from a variety of medical, nutritional, and physical health experts. We'll discover which types of foods may harm us and which may help. We'll study the science behind the medicine and technology used by millions of diabetics the world over. We'll learn how to cook some simple, delicious, cost-effective, and healthy snacks and meals. Natural foods perfect for diabetics and non-diabetics alike. And we'll also discover safe, easy, and effective exercises we can do from the comfort of our own homes, or just beyond our front doors.
It's just amazing when we think about the obesity rates today. Here in the US, they estimate that roughly 36% of our population is clinically obese. 68% of the people are considered overweight and/or obese here in the United States. In New Zealand, they're coming in roughly between 65 to 67%. So this is becoming a real globalized issue throughout the world, and we all need to come together to start educating each other and doing the right things so we can rapidly reduce this and get it back to where it was not so long ago.
Imagine 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, you wouldn't know this. You would be merely going on and having things happening to your body. You wouldn't know about it until there was a negative consequence. Now you do know, you know early. You can make those changes. You can tell your children about it. You can change your diet. You can help them change their diet. You can do all sorts of positive things as a result of that diagnosis.
If you have type 2 diabetes and you work on it and you set your goals and you start achieving things, I wish I could show you where you'd be in 6 months' time, because I was sure my life was over and that it was only going to get more painful, more tiring, and I was never going to leave the country and I was never going to leave my house. But just by achieving the things I've achieved has opened so many doors for me. Every time you move forward, another door will open and it leads to another door. You don't have to stay where you are and stuck in your diagnosis. Things will happen for you, just like they did for me. And you can do this.
And so now we know that there are many complex reasons why a person may develop type 1, type 2, or prediabetes. If you are already living with diabetes, don't blame yourself. You did not choose to become diabetic, but you can choose to do something about it. Maybe watching this series is amongst your first steps on a path towards greater health. If so, I truly hope you will continue with me on this journey of knowledge and understanding. Together, we can uncover the secrets to living a healthier, happier, and longer life. A life beyond diabetes.